Randy?
Philip, in terms of the county's concerns, what's your single biggest financial concern about a project like this? Not particularly this one, but understanding that habitat restoration may be in our future and that this probably won't be the last project to come before Yolo County. What's the single biggest financial issue for the county?
Well, for us, it would be farmland being taken out of production and the effects of that on the broader economy, including those directly involved in farming the property, as well as the support industries that serve agriculture in the county, et cetera.
Do you think that moving forward, and I know this will be a lot of negotiations to reach an agreement that's acceptable and permittable by the county, can we expect this to become a model for future types of restoration projects that would meet the requirements of the county financially?
It's possible. We need to take a closer look at the economic analysis for this project. And as I mentioned in my comments, and as Byron also mentioned, I think the economics of this project, assuming the figures that have been presented are correct, there's not a lot of detriment to the county in a general sense. Now, agriculture or support industries in the county may suffer some small impact as a result, but the broader county economy may not be adversely affected. So I don't know whether some of the harder issues that we see presented by larger proposals, such as the restoration of seasonal floodplain habitat and the bypass on the scale of 17 to 20,000 acres, and the potential effect of that type of project on higher value farmland, land used for rice, tomatoes, some of the real economic drivers of our ag industry. Those types of issues, I think, will be far more complicated to resolve than issues associated with this project economically. So its value as a model for those may be limited, I suspect.
Don? Mr. Ray.
Well, I was going to say, I think there's a couple lessons for us in here. One is to think about the long lead time. 8 years ago, they started looking at the property. They've been planning it for 3 years. They're about to now release the draft environmental impact report. And when we think about how the covered action process might work, I've often suggested that the time to file your consistency certification is when you issue the notice of determination you adopt the final EIR. So they'll have been at this process typically for many years and have spent many $1 million, most project proponents, by the time somebody certifies that their action is consistent with the Delta plan. So I think that indicates sort of how important the coordination functions are, both in terms of our staff and the science program working with people early on, as well as using the tools that we have, the implementation committee, and just our ability to reach out through the normal processes of government to make sure that we're working together with people. I think it also shows the stake we have in the CEQA reform process that's underway, because we've all been saying, well, when we see the EIR, we'll know this, that, and the other thing, and be able to make better judgments. If you were to imagine ways to reform CEQA, you might think, well, let's eliminate requirements for environmental impact reports in situations where it seems hard you could have an environmental impact report, like a habitat restoration program to carry out a conservation plan. But here we can see, at least in this case, many people are looking forward to the information that it'll have. We think about how this might fit within the framework of the Delta plan. We've got a performance measure that says let's make progress towards the 7,000 plus acres of tidal marsh and other habitat restoration that the biological opinions call for. We identified 2 priority habitat restoration areas that overlap with the area that this project's carried out in, right at the junction between the Cache Slough area and the Yolo bypass. We suggested that we should be paying attention to elevation when we do habitat restoration projects to make sure that we're taking advantage of the landscape and providing transitions that will work as the climate changes. And so you can hear they're still tinkering with that as they try to think through how to both meet the regulatory requirement to have tidal marsh today versus thinking in the long term, how's the landscape going to change if there's more floodwater put down the bypass in the future, or if the seas rise, and how do they make both a wise business decision as well as meet the regulatory requirements. But they are obviously thinking about, we said, let's think about things in a landscape perspective. Let's not view each of these projects in isolation. They're obviously thinking about that in terms of the setting next to the Prospect Island and Liberty Island restorations that have already occurred. And even they're thinking about it in terms of the landscape of time. They're doing planning for an adjacent piece of property that they don't yet own, but that would logically be an element of this larger restored area should they be able to acquire it in the future. With the adaptive management program, too, that the Delta Plan calls for, obviously plays an important role as they carry the project out. They're looking at it partly in their conversations with the county about apparently how would they be able to train local folks to be able to participate in the monitoring and landscape management that will be required under that adaptive management plan. And of course, the other thing that their county is asking for is, hey, assure us this is going to be well managed in the future, that it won't be some abandoned site that causes us trouble sometime down the line, and that's something else that the adaptive management plan is going to have to deal with. Two of the outstanding issues that we began to deal with when we had heard the Delta Protection Commission's economic sustainability plan were how we deal with impacts to agriculture and what are the responsibilities of agencies to consider impacts on adjacent lands. In this case, the project actually conforms with the policy of the Delta Plan that existing public lands be used first, because here we've got a situation where a local water district already owns the property, and it's being proposed for restoration now rather than going out and acquiring some private land. But obviously there's some considerations to be worked out in terms of thinking about the impacts on adjacent land. But you could sure hear the difficulty of regulatory coordination. They got 15 different agencies plus Yolo County adopting maybe a new ordinance and a variety of regulatory permits there. So I think you can see the complexity of these kind of projects are going to bring to the council's actions, that the Delta Plan really anticipates many of the issues that are going to arise very well. But it's going to be really a challenge to consider these projects in a way that's effective. We don't want to get at the tail end and be the guys who blow things up. If we're successful, the coordinating role of the council in helping projects come along so they all fit together is going to be important. And there'll always be some things that we're going to have to, we're not going to be able to resolve completely. In this case, the question of, hey, how do we avoid prejudicing the flood board's options to bring additional water down the bypass someday in the future if that's part of a big regional flood control system to reduce flood damages, in the Sacramento area, or relieve flood heights further up the Sac River watershed. We maybe can't do much more than just try to make sure we don't prejudice the choices that they might have in redesigning the project. If I was a flood control engineer, I wouldn't necessarily want to be putting a protected habitat for an endangered species right at the outlet of a flood control channel I knew I might want to change in the future. And so those are kinds of questions we'll have to be developed in ways to say, hey, how do we avoid prejudicing their options sometime down the line while we act today with the information, the needs we have now. But it's a great example of the kinds of projects that I think we'll be seeing, more often as we get into implementation.